The year was 1933. Across Europe, the air was thick with a tension that few could name, but everyone could feel. The world had emerged from one war that had cost a generation, yet the peace that followed was fragile. A thin layer of calm stretched over the embers of resentment and ambition. In Germany, a man named Adolf Hitler had risen from the chaos of the Great War to power, and he spoke with a fire that drew desperate men to his side. Factories that had stood silent since the armistice began to stir once more. Hidden workshops hummed with activity as engineers and soldiers rebuilt the weapons of a future war that the world pretended would never come. In London, the British government watched uneasily. The Great War had scarred the nation, and its people swore never to relive it. Military budgets were slashed. The Royal Air Force remained small, and the thought of large-scale conflict felt almost unthinkable. Britain had once ruled the waves, but it was unprepared for a new kind of battle, one that would be fought not on the sea, but in the sky. In the quiet offices of Whitehall, reports trickled in. Germany was rearming in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Fighter squadrons were being trained in secret. Bombers, fast, long-range and devastating, were rolling out of assembly lines. The shadow of the Luftwaffe was taking shape long before its name was known. To the Air Ministry, one fact was painfully clear. If war returned, Britain would be at the mercy of German air power. The Channel, that had protected the island for centuries, would no longer be enough. The next war would begin with sirens, not ships. Across the English countryside, villagers went about their lives unaware that they lived within reach of destruction. The very concept of a massive aerial assault on civilian cities seemed unreal, the stuff of science fiction. But a few men within the Air Ministry had begun to imagine it, and it terrified them. Among them was a quiet urgency to find a solution, some method of detecting approaching aircraft before they reached British shores. But how? The technology of the time offered little hope. Human eyes could not pierce the fog or night. Sound locators, giant acoustic mirrors placed along the coast, could only pick up aircraft a few miles away, and only in the right weather. It was like trying to defend a nation with one's ears. The gap between detection and destruction was enormous. A bomber flying at 200 miles per hour could cross the channel in minutes. By the time it was seen or heard, it would already be overhead. In 1934, the Air Ministry's Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defense was formed to address this terrifying problem. It gathered some of Britain's brightest scientific minds, physicists, engineers, and inventors, to answer a single question. Could science make Britain see the unseen? The committee sent out a proposal, one that bordered on desperation. They asked Britain's scientists to design a death ray, a beam of energy powerful enough to destroy enemy aircraft at a distance. Most dismissed it as absurd. No known form of energy could deliver such force over miles of air. But one man working far from the centers of power saw the question differently. He didn't dream of destroying aircraft with energy beams. He wondered if energy could instead find them. That man was Robert Watson Watt, a Scottish engineer and meteorologist employed by the Radio Research Station. His work had nothing to do with war. He spent his days studying the way radio waves reflected off the upper atmosphere to track thunderstorms. To most, it was obscure science. To him, it was a passion for understanding the invisible forces of nature. But in those radio waves, he had seen something that few others noticed. He had observed that when lightning flashed, radio signals scattered in peculiar patterns. The air itself became a mirror, reflecting invisible energy back to Earth. It was an elegant idea, and it stayed with him. If lightning could reflect radio energy, could an airplane? That question, simple yet revolutionary, would soon rewrite the course of history. By the winter of 1934, reports of Germany's secret rearmament were no longer rumors. The construction of military airfields, the training of pilots, and the rapid expansion of aircraft production painted a grim picture. Britain's planners realized they had only a few years, perhaps less, before German bombers would be capable of reaching London. The urgency intensified. In February 1935, the Air Ministry formally requested proposals for this death ray. Their letter, addressed to Watson Watt's superior, asked if his department could produce such a weapon. Watson Watt read it carefully, then wrote back with dry Scottish wit, "No known radio frequency is capable of killing a sheep, let alone an aircraft." But he added something more, a suggestion that would change everything. Instead of a death ray, he proposed building a radio detection system, one that could locate aircraft long before they reached their targets. He wasn't sure it would work. The science was untested, but the theory was sound. When radio waves struck a solid object, part of the signal bounced back. If those echoes could be detected and measured, the position of an aircraft could be known. It was a leap of imagination, one that only a man who spent his life listening to the whispers of the atmosphere could make. The Air Ministry hesitated. It wasn't what they had asked for. Yet they had no better ideas. And so, in the closing days of February 1935, Robert Watson Watt was granted permission to conduct an experiment that would test the impossible. The location would be a quiet field near the town of Daventry. The equipment, little more than a BBC radio transmitter, a few receiving aerials, and a borrowed aircraft. As the sun set over the English countryside on that cold February evening, the engineers prepared their crude instruments. The sky was silent except for the distant hum of engines. No one there could have known that what they were about to witness would mark the beginning of a new era in warfare. In a few moments, a simple pulse of radio waves would reveal the shape of the future, a future where the invisible became visible, and one man's insane idea would soon expose the most secret war strategy the world had ever known. In the wind-swept hills of Brechin, Scotland, a boy once stood in his backyard, staring at a thunderstorm tearing across the sky. Lightning cracked in the distance, thunder rolled a few seconds later, and young Robert Watson Watt counted the delay between the flash and the sound. He didn't know it then, but that fascination with storms would one day change the fate of an entire war. Robert was never the loudest in the room. He wasn't a soldier or a politician, just a wiry man with restless eyes and a mind that never stopped questioning. Where others saw danger in lightning, he saw patterns. Where others flinched, he measured. His curiosity wasn't just a habit, it was a way of life. By the time he joined the British Meteorological Office, the Great War was already history, but its shadow lingered. The world was rebuilding, nations rearming quietly. Watson Watt's job, however, was simple. Study the sky, predict storms, and help pilots avoid lightning. No one in his office knew that the same lightning he studied would one day expose invisible enemies. He built his first instruments in a cramped lab filled with copper wires, wooden tables, and the smell of burning circuits. The devices clicked and hummed as they picked up static bursts from distant storms. Each spark of lightning released a wave of radio energy, invisible yet measurable. Robert was obsessed with these waves. He called them atmospherics, a beautiful, almost poetic name for nature's static. While his colleagues saw weather reports, he saw signals, data that spoke a secret language. To him, lightning wasn't chaos. It was code, but his superiors didn't share his imagination. "We're meteorologists, not dreamers," one of them said. "Leave the radio experiments to the physicists." Robert didn't argue. He simply nodded and returned to his workbench. But deep inside, he knew he was standing on the edge of something extraordinary. By the mid-1930s, the world was changing. Europe was a chessboard again, and Germany was quietly rearranging its pieces. Military build-up, secret exercises, strange signals heard on the airwaves, all signs that something dark was stirring. The British Air Ministry was worried. If bombers ever crossed the Channel again, how could Britain see them before they struck? They began asking impossible questions. Could a beam of radio waves detect an aircraft in flight? Most scientists dismissed the idea. "It's madness," they said. A plane is too small, the signal too weak. You'd never detect it. But when the Air Ministry's letter reached Watson Watt's desk, his eyes lit up. Madness, perhaps, but not impossible. Not to him. He remembered those old experiments with lightning. If a storm could produce radio waves that his instruments could detect from hundreds of miles away, why couldn't an aircraft reflect similar waves? Maybe, he thought, planes could become their own kind of lightning. He grabbed a notebook and began sketching. Lines, angles, reflections, a radio transmitter here, a receiver there. If a signal bounced back, it could reveal not just the presence of an aircraft, but its distance and direction. It was all theory, but it made perfect sense to him. His pencil moved faster. He wasn't just writing equations. He was writing the blueprint of a new kind of vision. That night, he couldn't sleep. The thought echoed in his mind. If lightning can be heard, maybe enemies can too. Watson Watt's proposal was simple, clear, and bold. He called it detection and location of aircraft by radio. He sent it up the chain, expecting rejection. But Britain was desperate, and desperate times make men listen to dreamers. Within weeks, he was summoned to London. The meeting took place in a grey, unheated office at the Air Ministry. A handful of officials sat around a table littered with cigarette ash and blueprints. They listened as he explained his theory, how radio waves could be used to see planes through the air, how Britain could build a line of invisible eyes across its coast. When he finished, silence filled the room. Finally, one officer leaned forward. "Can you prove it, Mr. Watson Watt?" Robert smiled faintly. "Give me 2 weeks." 2 weeks later, on a chilly February morning in 1935, Watson Watt stood in a muddy field near Daventry, England. Next to him, his assistant Arnold Wilkins adjusted a clumsy-looking radio set. The transmitter was aimed at the sky. A Royal Air Force bomber was ordered to fly overhead. The air was thick with tension. As the plane approached, the receiver needle trembled, then jumped. There it was, a flicker, a heartbeat, proof. The invisible had been made visible. Robert Watson Watt had just done what no one thought possible. He had heard an aircraft through radio waves. Not with eyes, not with sound, but with science. He didn't shout or celebrate. He simply nodded and whispered, "There it is." That moment, the brief twitch of a needle, was the birth of radar. When the report reached the Air Ministry, jaws dropped. A few men called it insane brilliance. Others just called it luck. But one thing was certain. Britain had found a weapon not of bullets or bombs, but of vision. Watson Watt, the quiet man who once measured lightning, had given his country a way to see the unseen. He never sought fame or fortune. He didn't care for medals or titles. What mattered to him was the work, the hum of machines, the thrill of discovery, the belief that knowledge could protect lives. Years later, when the war finally came, and Britain's radar towers watched the skies day and night, many would owe their lives to that one crazy idea. But for now, in 1935, Robert Watson Watt simply went home, removed his jacket, and looked out the window as another storm rolled in. Lightning flashed. Thunder followed, and he smiled. The morning of February 26, 1935, was cold enough to bite through wool. A grey mist hung over the English countryside, and the earth was slick with rain. In an empty field outside Daventry, 2 men stood beside a jumble of equipment, metal rods, car batteries, and radio receivers humming with static. They weren't soldiers. They weren't spies. They were engineers chasing an idea that most of Britain's scientists had already dismissed as fantasy. At the center of it all stood Robert Watson Watt, his collar turned up against the wind, a worn leather notebook in his hand. Next to him, his assistant Arnold Wilkins, young and sharp-eyed, adjusted the dials on a large receiver unit connected by cables to a wooden frame. A few hundred feet away, the Royal Air Force's Hayford bomber waited for the signal to take off. No one watching that day could have guessed they were about to witness a moment that would quietly rewrite the rules of modern warfare. The setup looked unimpressive. more like a farmer's radio than the foundation of a revolutionary defense system. But to Watson Watt, it represented something bigger than the sum of its parts. For weeks, he and Wilkins had fought skepticism and ridicule. "You'll never detect a plane with that thing," one colleague had said. "The signal will bounce off the clouds before it ever finds an aircraft." But Watson Watt believed otherwise. He had spent years studying the way lightning flashed across the horizon and how its radio energy could be tracked from miles away. If nature could broadcast its power across the sky, so could an aircraft. Today, he would prove it. As the bomber lifted off and began its slow pass over the countryside, the receiver needle quivered, then dipped. Wilkins adjusted the frequency slightly. Then the impossible happened. The needle jumped sharply. Once, twice, each time the aircraft crossed their invisible radio beam. Watson Watt stared at the dial, hardly breathing. The machine was hearing something that no human ear could. A silent reflection from the sky, proof that their theory worked. "Do you see it?" Wilkins asked, his voice trembling. Watson Watt nodded slowly. "I see it," he murmured. "It's there." For a moment both men were silent. The sound of the bomber's engines faded into the distance, but on the receiver the signal pulsed, steady, alive, undeniable. The invisible had become visible. Back in London, when the results reached the Air Ministry, few could believe them. The test was simple, yet the implications were profound. A machine could now see aircraft through the air using nothing but radio waves. The ministry summoned Watson Watt immediately. His notes and diagrams were laid out on a long table. The same officials who had once smirked at his theories now leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Tell us what this means," one of them demanded. Watson Watt, calm as ever, replied, "It means, gentlemen, that we no longer have to wait to be bombed before we can defend ourselves." That single sentence changed everything. Within days, funding was approved for an experimental radar station. Watson Watt and his team were moved to a small research facility in Orfordness, a lonely stretch of coast in Suffolk, where the sea wind howled through the dunes. There, under conditions of secrecy, they began refining their discovery into a working system that could one day shield an entire nation. They called it radio detection and ranging. Radar. The work was grueling. Equipment failed. Signals vanished. The technology was crude and temperamental, often picking up echoes from ships, birds, even clouds. But slowly, painfully, the engineers began to understand the language of the radio waves. Each echo carried information: distance, direction, speed. The trick was to interpret the noise correctly, to make sense of what the air was whispering. Watson Watt was relentless. "If we can hear one plane," he said, "we can hear 100. And that was exactly what Britain needed. Across the Channel, Adolf Hitler was rebuilding Germany's air power in secret. New bombers rolled off assembly lines under the cover of night. The Luftwaffe was growing stronger by the day, and though few yet dared to speak it aloud, another war was coming. Watson Watt's radar could be the only thing standing between Britain and destruction. By late 1935, the Air Ministry ordered the construction of a network of experimental radar stations along the coast. Each would use tall steel towers to transmit radio pulses into the sky, searching for echoes of approaching aircraft. The first prototypes were crude, but when a test flight flew through their detection beam, the results were undeniable. The signal returned, just as it had at Daventry, but stronger, clearer, sharper. Watson Watt's crazy idea was now a functioning reality. One evening, after a long day of testing, he stood outside the Orfordness hut, watching the North Sea fade into darkness. The radio towers loomed like skeletal giants against the horizon. Wilkins joined him. "Do you think they'll ever really use it?" he asked. Watson Watt smiled faintly. "They'll have no choice," he said. "The storm is coming." In the years to come, people would call the Daventry test a miracle, but Watson Watt never did. To him, it was simply the moment when patience met preparation, when an engineer's curiosity became his country's salvation. What began as a crude experiment in a muddy field would soon evolve into a chain of radar stations stretching from Scotland to the Isle of Wight, a shield of radio waves that would later be known as Chain Home. When the Luftwaffe finally came in 1940, Britain would not be blind, and it all began with a twitching needle in a wet English field, and two men who refused to believe that seeing the unseen was impossible. By 1936, the English coast had begun to change. Steel towers rose from the cliffs like silent sentinels, their cables humming softly in the wind. To fishermen and villagers, they looked like strange radio masts or maybe secret communication posts. But only a handful of people in the country knew the truth. These towers were Britain's new eyes. The project was codenamed Chain Home. Its architect, Robert Watson Watt. Its purpose, to give Britain warning before the enemy struck. What had begun as a single flicker on a receiver at Daventry was now turning into a national defense system, a wall of invisible sight. In a small room at Orfordness, Watson Watt and his growing team worked day and night, their desks cluttered with coffee cups, soldering irons, and endless spools of copper wire. The equipment buzzed, sparked, and smoked. Every improvement came at the cost of a dozen failures. They had one goal: to build a network that could see hundreds of miles across the sky, detecting bombers long before they reached British soil. It was an audacious dream, but the dream was taking form. The first towers went up along the east coast, 25 of them, each one nearly 400 feet tall. From their tops, powerful transmitters sent out pulses of radio energy that swept across the sea like invisible searchlights. When an aircraft crossed that beam, the signal bounced back, a faint echo, but enough to be read by skilled operators. At the receiving end sat young men and women with headphones pressed tight, their eyes fixed on flickering cathode screens. They listened to static, to patterns of hums and clicks. To most people it was just noise, but to them it was language. Each spike of interference, each ghostly flicker, told them where something was moving in the sky. Radar wasn't perfect. It couldn't yet tell friend from foe. It couldn't yet pinpoint altitude. But it could see what no human eye could, and that alone was revolutionary. By 1937, the Chain Home system stretched from the Thames estuary to the Scottish border, forming a line of early warning coverage unlike anything in the world. No other nation, not even Germany, had anything close to it. Still, inside the Air Ministry, skepticism lingered. Some commanders grumbled that the radar was too slow, too experimental, too unreliable for combat. They preferred the old methods: binoculars, observation posts, human scouts. But Watson Watt knew what was coming. He knew eyes and ears wouldn't be enough against modern war machines. He once said to a fellow engineer, "The next war won't be fought by men who see, but by nations that can know before they see." At the same time, the world outside was shifting. Germany, now under Hitler's iron hand, was rearming openly. The Luftwaffe held air parades so vast they blotted out the sun. British intelligence reports spoke of new high-speed bombers, new tactics, and terrifying plans for air dominance. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin warned the nation in Parliament, "The bomber will always get through." It was a grim truth until Watson Watt's invisible wall began to rise. Chain Home would challenge that fatalism. For the first time in history, a nation could see its attackers coming before they arrived. In the operations rooms, the new system came to life. Massive plotting tables displayed the British coastline covered in grids and symbols. Women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAAF, moved coloured markers across the maps as radar operators relayed coordinates from the towers. Blips on screens turned into movements on charts. What had once been invisible became visible in real time. It was the birth of air command and control, a completely new way of fighting. Now, instead of scrambling pilots blindly, Britain could direct its fighters precisely where the enemy was headed. Seconds became minutes. Minutes became survival. Watson Watt often visited the coastal towers. He wasn't the type to sit behind a desk while others tested his ideas. One night at Bawdsey Manor, where the main radar research team was stationed, he climbed to the top of one of the transmitter towers. The sea wind roared, the lights of Felixstowe flickered in the distance, and the cables hummed like a giant metal harp. Below him, his team worked tirelessly. The faces of these young technicians, men barely in their 20s, women with steady hands, glowed in the faint light of their instruments. They didn't know it yet, but they were building the very shield that would one day save them all. Watson Watt looked out over the dark water and whispered to himself, "Let them come. We'll see them first." By 1938, his system had grown so powerful that it could detect aircraft over 100 miles away. When Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding visited the site for a demonstration, the radar tracked multiple planes approaching from the sea. The blips appeared on the display, precise, unmistakable. Dowding watched silently for a long moment, then turned to Watson Watt. "This," he said quietly, "will change the war." And he was right. But even as Britain's invisible wall rose higher, danger crept closer. Across the Channel, Germany was perfecting its own deadly science. The Messerschmitt, the Stuka, the Heinkel, machines built for destruction. War was no longer a possibility. It was a clock counting down. Inside his lab, Watson Watt worked longer hours, his hair now streaked with grey. He had no illusions about what was coming. Radar wasn't a weapon. It couldn't shoot down planes or destroy bombs. But it could see, and that made it priceless. Soon, his wall of invisible eyes would face its ultimate test. By early 1939, as Europe plunged toward conflict, Chain Home was officially operational. Towers stretched like iron spines along Britain's eastern coast, scanning the skies every second of every day. Their signals reached out to sea, echoing back from the unseen, creating an invisible net of protection. For the first time in history, Britain could look across the sky and know what was coming before the enemy even crossed its borders. In the summer of that same year, as the sun set over Bawdsey Manor, Robert Watson Watt stood on the cliffs once more. Behind him, the radar masts shimmered in the dying light. Ahead, the sea was calm, deceptively calm. He took a deep breath and said softly, "The wall is ready." And far away, in Germany, the engines of war were already beginning to roar. By 1939, the world was holding its breath. Europe trembled beneath the boots of marching armies, and the skies above were no longer just blue, they were strategic. Weaponized and waiting, while Britain built its wall of invisible eyes, Germany was crafting something far more menacing, an air force so vast and advanced that it could strike terror before a single bomb ever fell. To most of the world, the Luftwaffe was still a rumor, a whisper of planes in secret hangars, of factories that worked through the night. But to the men who listened to radio waves, to the engineers who measured signals and echoes, the truth was clear. Something enormous was taking shape behind the clouds, and in the heart of that shadow stood one man, Hermann Göring, former ace pilot, now commander of Hitler's new air empire. When Göring inspected his airfields, he didn't just see machines. He saw power, the kind that could bend nations to their knees. Under his command, Germany poured every ounce of its industrial might into the creation of a flying army, the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the sleek hunter that could climb faster than any British fighter, the Heinkel He 111, a bomber with long wings and a belly full of destruction, and the terrifying Stuka dive bombers, whose screaming sirens made their victims freeze in fear before the bombs even landed. Each new design carried a message to the world. The skies belonged to Germany now. From Berlin to Bremen, production lines ran 24 hours a day. New airfields sprouted like mushrooms across the Reich. The Luftwaffe's pilots trained relentlessly, learning to dive, strafe, and vanish into cloud cover before the enemy could react. They rehearsed coordinated attacks on radio towers, factories, and coastal defenses, the very things Britain was now desperately trying to protect. But Britain's intelligence service, MI6, was not blind. Their agents whispered of secret bases hidden in the forests of Bavaria and Silesia. They intercepted German signals, strange bursts of coded transmissions across the radio spectrum. Even the scientists at Orfordness picked up faint, unexplained frequencies coming from the continent. Something was out there. Something big. Inside the Air Ministry, the tension was electric. Reports flooded in, some exaggerated, some horrifyingly accurate. German bombers, the Heinkels and Dorniers, could now fly farther and faster than before. They could carry heavier payloads and attack cities hundreds of miles away. One intelligence officer laid out a chart showing the reach of the Luftwaffe. A red circle was drawn around Germany. Within that circle sat London. Silence filled the room. Then came the question no one wanted to ask aloud. When they come, how will we see them? That was when Robert Watson Watt's name surfaced again. Watson Watt wasn't a soldier, but he was now considered as vital as any general. His radar network, Chain Home, was still being fine-tuned, still fragile, but it was the only thing that could give Britain precious minutes of warning before an attack. In early 1939, he was summoned once more to London to meet with Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the quiet, calculating leader of Fighter Command. Dowding wasn't prone to emotion. He dealt in logistics, not hope, but he understood radar's potential better than most. "Your machines," Dowding said. "They'll tell us when they're coming. My pilots will handle the rest." Watson Watt nodded. "Then let's make sure they never arrive unseen." Meanwhile, across the Channel, German engineers were making discoveries of their own. In a laboratory near Rechlin, a group of physicists tested a new radio device designed to guide bombers at night. It used radio beams, narrow, precise, to lead aircraft to their targets even in darkness or fog. The code name Knickebein, crooked leg. It was an ingenious idea, where Britain's radar detected aircraft by bouncing signals off them. Germany's system used signals to lead them, two sides of the same science facing off in silence, their inventions racing toward confrontation. As months passed, Hitler's ambitions grew louder. He invaded Czechoslovakia, then Poland. Then in a flash of steel and fire, he unleashed the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. Tanks rolled, cities fell, and the world watched in disbelief at how fast the German war machine moved. But it wasn't just tanks and troops that conquered Europe. It was the sky. The Luftwaffe cleared the path ahead, raining bombs on cities before the first German soldier ever crossed the border. Poland's air defenses were wiped out in days. France would later fall in weeks. Everywhere the German bombers went, resistance crumbled beneath them. They were ghosts in the clouds, appearing without warning, vanishing before the smoke cleared. To Britain, it was a terrifying preview of what was to come. In London, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's voice echoed through the radio in September 1939. "I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany." The words hung heavy in every home, every pub, every factory. War had returned to Europe. At Bawdsey Manor, Watson Watt gathered his team. The atmosphere was grim but resolute. Their invention, once dismissed as crazy science, was now Britain's first line of defense. He looked around at the young faces. Scientists, radio operators, mechanics, each of them aware that what they built might decide who lived and who died. He said only one thing: "Then let's make sure they never take us by surprise." By the time 1940 dawned, the Luftwaffe had more than 2,500 combat aircraft ready for war. Its pilots were hardened, its tactics tested, its commander confident. Across the North Sea, Britain had barely 700 fighters and a radar system that was still being patched together tower by tower. The world's mightiest air force was preparing to strike. And in a quiet coastal hut, Robert Watson Watt stared at a flickering radar screen and whispered to himself, "The storm I've been waiting for is here." The summer of 1940 arrived not with warmth but with dread. Across the English Channel, a storm of steel and smoke was gathering. France had fallen. Belgium was gone. Holland was burning. Only Britain remained, an island fortress staring down the full might of Hitler's war machine. Every man, woman and child knew what was coming next. The invasion. The sky would be the first battlefield. In secret coastal huts and radar towers, men and women worked around the clock, eyes fixed on glowing screens. They weren't soldiers. They were listeners, guardians of an invisible wall built on radio waves. And they knew that when the first attack came, their machines would face the ultimate test. In late June, the first faint echoes appeared on the radar screens of Chain Home. Dots, flickers, pulses. The operators leaned in closer. At first, they thought it might be weather interference, or perhaps training flights. But soon, the pattern became clear. Hundreds of aircraft crossing the channel. The call went out. Raid detected, heading 220 degrees. Altitude unknown. Phones rang across the country. In underground bunkers, plotters pushed colored markers across maps as voices shouted coordinates from radar stations up and down the coast. The sound of teleprinters filled the air. Britain's new eyes were open, and the enemy was in sight. For the first time in history, a nation was watching an aerial invasion unfold before it began. The incoming planes were German Heinkel, He-111s, Dornier 17s, and Messerschmitt Bf-109 escorts. They came in waves, their shadows crawling across the channel like a moving storm front. The British radar towers caught them early, 20, 40, 60 miles out. By the time the first bombs fell on the coast, Fighter Command was already in the air. The Spitfires and Hurricanes scrambled from their bases, climbing hard through the clouds. Pilots barely had time to fasten their oxygen masks. Some were still pulling on their gloves as their aircraft roared skyward. For months they had trained for this moment. But now, with real bombers approaching London, Portsmouth and Dover, the training ended and survival began. Inside the Fighter Command operations room at Bentley Priory, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding stood before a giant plotting table. Colored markers covered the southern coast. Each one represented a group of aircraft. Blue for friendly, red for hostile. The red markers were multiplying fast, but this time Dowding wasn't guessing where they would strike. He knew because Watson Watt's invisible wall had already told him. Scramble number 11 group, Dowding ordered. Intercept over the Thames estuary. The message shot through the network. From command centers to airfields, from airfields to cockpits. Engines roared. Tires left the ground. And within minutes, the hunters met the hunted. High above the English countryside, the Battle of Britain had begun. The first clashes were chaotic. The air filled with roaring engines, tracer fire, and black plumes of smoke. Pilots shouted over radios, the words breaking through static. Enemy bombers sighted, engaging. R2 on my tail, breaking left. On the ground, radar operators could do nothing but watch the changing echoes, each fading blip, a story they might never know the end of. But they had done their job. They had given Dowding's men something priceless: time. For the first time in modern warfare, Britain's defenders were in the air before the bombs fell. At Bawdsey Manor, Robert Watson Watt and his team monitored the radar screens as reports poured in. They weren't in command of fighters. They didn't carry guns. But they understood that their machines, once mocked as toys, were now the nervous system of Britain's defense. Watson Watt leaned over a receiver, his eyes following the faint blips. "They're tracking perfectly," said his assistant, Arnold Wilkins. "Look, they're hitting the formation before it crosses the coast." Watson Watt didn't smile. His jaw was set. "It's working," he said softly. "But this is only the beginning. The Luftwaffe didn't come just once. They came every day. Morning to night, the skies roared with battle. Radar operators grew exhausted, their eyes aching from staring at green glowing screens. The WEF plotters in underground rooms worked until their fingers cramped, moving counters across the map with trembling hands. The tension never stopped. Every time a radar tower reported raid detected somewhere across the channel, hundreds of German bombers were already airborne. But Britain's invisible wall was holding. Each new raid was detected earlier, each interception more precise. Watt's radar net stretched from the south coast all the way to Scotland, and not a single bomber crossed unnoticed. Still, the strain was immense. The enemy soon learned of the radar towers and began to target them. One morning, a Stuka squadron dove straight at the towers at Ventnor and Dover, unleashing bombs that ripped through the steel structures. The operators fled through smoke and debris as the transmitters fell silent, but even then the chain held. Damaged towers were repaired within days. Replacement equipment arrived overnight. For every radar that went down, 2 more seemed to come alive. It wasn't just technology anymore. It was determination. As the Battle of Britain raged through July and August, Germany threw everything it had at the island. Thousands of bombs fell. Cities burned. But no matter how fierce the assault, the enemy never caught Britain blind. The radar screens became Britain's heartbeat, pulsing, steady, alive. From those ghostly green glows came the rhythm of resistance, and when the German pilots returned home at dusk, they were stunned. They had attacked with precision, with surprise, yet the RAF was always waiting for them. To them, it seemed supernatural, but it wasn't. It was science and the quiet genius of a Scottish engineer who once listened to lightning. By September 1940, after months of failed raids, Göring demanded answers. "How are they always there before us?" he shouted in rage. No one could explain it. The Luftwaffe had never seen anything like it before. They didn't yet understand that an invisible network, Chainhome, was watching them every step of the way. Back in Britain, when the last wave of that day's attack faded from the radar screens, Watt finally exhaled. He looked around at his exhausted team, their faces lit by the soft green glow of the monitors. "They said it couldn't be done," he whispered. "But we saw them, every single one." The first true test of radar had ended not in failure, but in triumph. Britain's coastline still stood. The invasion had been delayed, and the men, who had once been called crazy scientists, had become the nation's first silent heroes. Yet even as they celebrated, Watt knew the war was far from over. Germany would adapt, the air war would evolve, and soon Britain's invisible eyes would have to stare deeper into the night than ever before. By the winter of 1940, the sun over Britain no longer brought warmth. Each night, when darkness settled over the island, the people braced themselves. The Luftwaffe had changed tactics. No longer did the bombers come by day, where radar and the RAF could meet them in open skies. Now they came by night, unseen, unheard, until the bombs were already falling. The age of the Blitz had begun. Cities were turned into firestorms. London burned for 57 nights straight. Coventry was flattened. Liverpool, Bristol, and Sheffield followed. The ground shook. Windows shattered miles away. The air reeked of smoke, oil, and blood. Families huddled in underground stations, clutching children as sirens wailed above. And up in the dark sky, the enemy moved like ghosts, invisible, silent, and merciless. Britain's radar network, the proud Chainhome system, could see far out to sea, but it was blind inland and nearly useless against low-flying bombers at night. The nation that had once seen the unseen was suddenly flying blind again. But Robert Watt and his circle of scientists refused to surrender. They had built one invisible shield. Now they would build another. In a cold laboratory near Malvern, engineers and physicists began work on something new. They called it AI, not artificial intelligence, but airborne interception radar. It was small enough to fit inside a night fighter, and powerful enough to track bombers in the dark. The problem? It had to work in total silence without giving away the fighter's position. And the operators would have to read flickering signals in a pitch-black cockpit while flying through anti-aircraft fire. It sounded impossible. But so had the first radar, Meanwhile, the Germans were preparing a weapon of their own. They called it Knickerbein, crooked leg. It was a radio beam guidance system that could lead bombers directly to their targets, even in total darkness. 2 radio beams, sent from transmitters in occupied Europe, would cross precisely over the target city. When the 2 tones merged into one, the bombers knew it was time to drop their payloads. It was mathematics turned into murder. And if Britain couldn't stop it, every major city would soon be reduced to ash. The mystery of Knickerbein was first uncovered by a British intelligence officer named Dr. Reginald Victor Jones, a physicist working for MI6's Scientific Intelligence Division. Jones noticed something strange. The Luftwaffe's bombing runs were too precise, even at night. He suspected that radio beams were guiding them. He proposed a daring plan: track the beams, jam them, turn the enemy's own technology against them. His idea was sent to the War Cabinet and was nearly dismissed as fantasy. But one man listened, Winston Churchill. Churchill summoned Jones personally. "Can you really blind their bombers?" he asked. Jones nodded. "Yes, Prime Minister, if we can find their beams before they find us." The race began. British engineers set up listening stations along the coast, using captured German frequencies to hunt for the beams. Night after night they scanned the airwaves, and then, faintly across static and interference, they found it a narrow tone, constant, unmoving, a beam stretching from Germany straight toward Derby. The hunt was over. The war of science had begun. Within days, British transmitters began jamming the Knickerbein signals. Instead of one clear tone, German pilots now heard confusion, a mess of false signals and phantom beacons. Some bombers dropped their bombs too early, others too late. Entire waves scattered into chaos. The Germans were furious. They adjusted their system, creating newer, stronger beams, Exjurat, Weigerat, each more advanced than the last. But every time they changed frequencies, Britain's boffins, as the scientists were called, found a way to jam them again. It became a battle of minds, fought not with bullets, but with invisible waves. As the beam war raged in the ether, another experiment took shape in the skies. In December 1940, a Bristol Blenheim fighter took off from an airfield in the dark. Inside sat a pilot and a radar operator. They were testing the first airborne interception system. The operator's screen showed 2 glowing blips, one for the bomber, one for themselves. He guided the pilot left, right, higher, closer. "Contact closing," he said, his voice calm despite the shaking of the aircraft. At 1,000 yards, the pilot could finally see it, a Heinkel bomber, black against the moonlight. He pressed the trigger. The German bomber exploded in a flash of fire that lit up the clouds. For the first time in history, a plane had hunted another plane using radar. Word of the success spread quickly. Soon, new radar-equipped Beaufighters took to the skies. They flew in pairs, one man flying, one watching the glowing scope, stalking enemy bombers through the dark. The Luftwaffe, once masters of the night, began to lose planes faster than they could replace them. The hunters had become the hunted. In his notes, Reginald Jones later wrote, "It was not our strength that saved us, but our wits." The Germans fought with numbers. We fought with nerves and noise, and he was right. Britain had turned radio waves, the very medium of the enemy's attack, into a shield of defense. By the end of 1941, the Knickerbein system was crippled. The beam war was over. London still stood battered but alive. And the night skies, once filled with death, now belonged to the watchers. In a quiet control room, Watson Watt listened to the faint hum of his machines. He knew that science had once again saved Britain, not with glory, not with medals, but with the invisible strength of the human mind. Outside, dawn broke over the ruins of the city. Smoke rose from the streets, but the flag still flew. The people were weary, but unbroken. Britain had survived the night. The year was 1941, and though the skies above Britain had quieted, the war had moved elsewhere, to the dark, endless sea. The Atlantic Ocean had become the most dangerous place on Earth. Across its cold, rolling waves, thousands of ships carried food, weapons, and hope from America to Britain. Without them, the island would starve. But beneath those same waters lurked an invisible enemy, Hitler's U-boats. They moved in packs like wolves. They stalked the convoys at night, rising silently from the deep to unleash their torpedoes before slipping away again. Each strike sent entire crews and cargoes to the bottom. Each sinking meant fewer supplies, fewer guns, fewer chances of survival. Britain called it the Battle of the Atlantic. And by 1941, it was a battle they were losing. The Admiralty's maps told a grim story. Every day, new red pins marked where ships had gone down. Sometimes 10 in one night, sometimes 20. The ocean itself seemed haunted, a graveyard of men and metal stretching from Canada to Ireland. Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later admit, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. The German submarines, commanded by Admiral Karl Dönitz, were fast, organized, and merciless. Using encrypted messages sent through the Enigma code machine, they coordinated their attacks with precision. When one U-boat found a convoy, it summoned others. Soon a dozen submarines would encircle the helpless merchant ships, attacking from every direction at once. The sea turned black. With oil and fire, Britain's destroyers and corvettes hunted the U-boats with depth charges and sonar, but it was like fighting shadows. Sonar could only detect submarines directly beneath the ship, not those waiting miles away. The Germans could strike first, vanish, and wait for the next convoy. But then came a question that changed everything. If radar could see through clouds, could it also see over water? Robert Watson Watt, now a senior advisor to the Admiralty, believed it could. He and his team began adapting their radar systems for ships and aircraft. They called the new device ASV, Air-to-Surface Vessel Radar. In early 1942, a British patrol plane, a long-range Hudson bomber, took off from the coast of Cornwall. On board was one of the first ASV radar sets. As the crew flew over the dark Atlantic, the operator watched the glowing screen. The sea was black. Then a faint blip. He adjusted the dial. The blip grew stronger. "Captain," he said quietly, "I think I see something." Far below, cutting through the moonlit waves, was the periscope of a U-boat preparing to dive. The Hudson swooped down and dropped its depth charges. Moments later, the sea erupted in a column of fire and water. The radar operator grinned. It worked. Word spread quickly. Soon, more patrol aircraft were equipped with ASV radar. They began patrolling the convoys, scanning the sea day and night. The U-boats, once invisible hunters, were now being hunted. But the Germans were clever. They developed radar detectors, warning them when an aircraft's radar beam was near. Once again, it became a duel of technology. Cat versus mouse, signal versus silence. The British countered with shorter wavelengths, harder to detect, clearer on screen. These new systems were called centimetric radar, powered by a revolutionary invention, the cavity magnetron. This single device, small enough to hold in one hand, changed everything. It allowed radar to operate at far higher frequencies, revealing details that had been invisible before. Now operators could see the outline of a periscope, the shape of a conning tower, even the wake behind a submarine. The ocean's secrets were finally visible. At sea, radar sets were installed on destroyers, corvettes, and even merchant ships. Sailors who had once stared helplessly into fog and darkness could now watch glowing screens that revealed the enemy before the first shot was fired. Convoys began arriving safely again. The red pins on the Admiralty's maps started to slow. Still, the battle was far from over. In the spring of 1943, Dönitz launched his largest Wolfpack operation yet. Dozens of U-boats swarmed the North Atlantic, determined to cut Britain's lifeline once and for all. The sea became a chessboard of life and death. Radar blips, sonar pings, coded signals, and desperate maneuvers. One night, the convoy on 207 came under attack. Radar operators aboard HMS Vimy detected strange echoes at the edge of their screen, moving slowly in formation. The captain gave the order, "Bring us about." Prepare depth charges. Moments later, the first explosion ripped through the waves. The radar showed another blip, closing fast. Target 200 yards, dead ahead! The crew dropped a full spread of charges. The sea frothed white. Then a silence. Moments later, debris floated to the surface. A torn piece of hull, oil, and the faint tragic glimmer of light fading beneath the waves. The crew cheered. Another wolf destroyed. By mid-1943, the tide had turned. Radar-equipped planes, now flying from bases in Iceland, Newfoundland, and the Azores, closed the deadly gap in the Atlantic. They hunted U-boats relentlessly, catching them on the surface at dawn or dusk. When they least expected it, the Germans called it Der Schwarze Tod, the Black Death. For every convoy sunk, 3 U-boats were now being destroyed. Nordernitz, who had once boasted of starving Britain into submission, was forced to withdraw his wolf packs from the Atlantic. The hunters had become the hunted once again. In his diary, one British sailor wrote, "The sea still takes men, but now it takes theirs too. We finally see what we fight. For the first time since the war began, supplies flowed freely. Britain could breathe again. The Americans prepared for their great counterattack, the liberation of Europe, and radar, born in secrecy, doubted by generals, mocked by ministers, had become the silent guardian of the Allied world. In the end, it wasn't the biggest guns or the fastest ships that won the Battle of the Atlantic. It was a pulse of energy, invisible and relentless, the heartbeat of radar, that turned darkness into daylight and fear into victory. As Watson Watt once said, "Give me the right wavelength, and I'll give you the world." And for a moment, as the North Atlantic lay calm under the moon, it felt true. By 1944, Europe was still under Hitler's iron grip, but far above the occupied continent, something extraordinary was happening. From the icy skies of the North Sea to the beaches of Normandy, the Allies had built a new kind of battlefield, one that existed not in land or sea, but in waves, echoes, and signals. The radar war was about to decide the fate of the world. For 5 years, radar had watched, warned, and protected. It had guided bombers through storms, found submarines beneath waves, and turned night into day. But now it would face its greatest test yet, Operation Overlord. The Allied invasion of France. It would be the largest amphibious landing in human history. Over 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 men crossing the English Channel under cover of darkness. Every movement, every vessel, every plane had to be hidden from German eyes. One wrong signal, one detected fleet, and the invasion would end before it began. And so, once again, the war's outcome rested not just on soldiers or generals, but on the scientists who controlled the invisible. At the heart of the plan was radar deception, a massive operation designed to convince Germany that the real invasion was coming from somewhere else. In the months leading up to June 6, 1944, the Allies filled the air with phantom armies, fake radio chatter, inflatable tanks, wooden landing craft, entire ghost divisions that existed only on paper and on the radar screens of the enemy. It was called Operation Fortitude, and it was one of the most brilliant illusions in military history. In England, near Dover, engineers installed powerful radar reflectors made of wire and foil, designed to mimic the signature of ships. Each one bounced back enemy radar waves just like a real vessel would. When German radar operators looked at their scopes, they saw an enormous fleet massing opposite Calais, the narrowest point of the channel. They had no idea that the real invasion force was assembling hundreds of miles away, in secret harbors stretching from Plymouth to Portsmouth. The deception worked flawlessly. Hitler's generals moved their reserves to the wrong coast. When D-Day arrived, the beaches of Normandy were defended, but not nearly enough. But radar didn't just hide the invasion, it also guided it. As dawn broke on June 6, 1944, the English Channel was alive with motion. Destroyers, battleships, transports, and landing craft churned through the mist, their engines humming like a single heartbeat. Above them, a fleet of bombers and gliders filled the sky. To keep order among the chaos, each Allied ship carried navigational radar, allowing them to find their position in fog, darkness, or enemy fire. Even when smoke screens blanketed the sea, the radar operators could still see the coastline, glowing shapes on their scopes marking cliffs, beaches, and landmarks. For many, it was their first glimpse of France, not through eyes, but through electronic vision. In the hours before the landing, airborne radar guided thousands of paratroopers to their drop zones behind enemy lines. Flying through heavy clouds and anti-aircraft fire, pilots used their radar to locate the French countryside below, rivers, bridges, roads. The troops leaped into darkness, trusting that the green glow on their screens was truth. Below, on the beaches, radar-equipped ships tracked every landing craft in real time, directing them through smoke and gunfire to their precise drop points. If one veered off course, a voice on the radio corrected it instantly. Without radar, the invasion would have dissolved into chaos before the first soldier touched the sand. The Germans, meanwhile, were blinded. Their own radar network, once feared and formidable, had been systematically destroyed or jammed in the days before the invasion. Allied bombers had pounded radar stations along the coast, while electronic warfare units flooded the airwaves with false echoes. To the German controllers, the sky appeared filled with hundreds of fake planes flying toward Calais. By the time they realized the truth, that the real invasion was at Normandy, it was too late. As the first landing craft reached Omaha Beach, the radar screens aboard command ships glowed with a storm of signals. Ships, planes, gunfire, echoes bouncing from cliffs and waves. Amid the noise, the operators tracked every movement, adjusting naval gunfire, directing reinforcements, and warning of counterattacks. For the soldiers on the ground, radar was invisible. But for the commanders offshore, it was their lifeline, a window through smoke, blood, and chaos. It told them who was winning, who was drowning, who needed help in real time. By nightfall, 156,000 Allied troops had landed. The beaches were secured. France had a foothold again. But even after D-Day, the radar war raged on. Every new advance had to be protected from Luftwaffe bombers. Radar-guided anti-aircraft guns tracked enemy raids with astonishing precision, and mobile radar units followed the front lines, warning of attacks before they struck. In the ruins of Normandy, among the tanks and broken cities, radar had become as essential as bullets. 1 week after the landings, Winston Churchill visited the coast. Standing on the deck of a command ship, he was handed a pair of headphones and shown a radar display. On the screen, hundreds of tiny blips marked ships moving toward France. Supplies, reinforcements, victory. He smiled quietly and said, "They thought they could hide from us." But science, it seems, has sharper eyes than man. As the Allies pushed inland, radar took to the air once again. British Mosquito and American P-61 Black Widow night fighters, armed with the latest radar, hunted enemy aircraft in the dark skies over France. Their glowing scopes revealed shapes the naked eye could not see, the faint ghost of a German bomber, the echo of a fleeing jet. The hunters of 1940 had returned, sharper and stronger than ever. By the end of the summer, the tide had turned completely. France was free. Germany was retreating. And in the command centers of Britain, one name began to fade from the headlines: radar. It had been too secret for too long, too technical for glory. But those who knew understood. Without those silent screens, without the invisible guardians in the sky, today would have been a massacre. The invasion of Normandy was a victory of courage, but also of science. And in that balance between flesh and frequency, the modern world was born. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world emerged from the shadows of destruction, broken, bruised, and reborn. Cities lay in ruins, nations were reshaped, and the boundaries of human courage had been rewritten. But among all the great victories, There was one invisible weapon that had quietly decided the fate of millions: radar. For years, the device had been hidden behind classified walls and sealed documents. No parades were held for it, no medals pinned to its metal frame. Yet its silent pulses had guarded the British skies, shielded convoys at sea, and given generals something they had never possessed before: the power to see the unseen. Arthur Lonsdale stood among the few who truly understood what that meant. After years of ridicule, sleepless nights, and being called insane, his idea had become the shield of a nation. It wasn't just about detecting planes anymore. It was about understanding how invisible waves could shape the visible world. In the weeks after the victory, Arthur returned to his old lab, the same dim room that once smelled of burnt circuits and stubborn hope. Dust clung to the walls, and the radar console sat silent, like a veteran resting after battle. He ran, his hand across the control panel, remembering the night those strange echoes revealed Germany's secret invasion plan. That single signal, that pulse of invisible energy, had changed everything. But history, as always, moved quickly. Within a few years, radar became more than a war tool. Scientists in Britain, America, and Japan began experimenting with the same radio waves for navigation, weather prediction, and even astronomy. Airports adopted it to guide aircraft through storms. Ships used it to avoid collisions in fog. Farmers used radar images to track rainfall. And somewhere, deep in the quiet of post-war laboratories, engineers began shaping another invention that would change the world again, one based on the same principles of reflection and detection. That invention was microwave communication. The same waves Arthur once used to spot enemy planes now carried voices, television broadcasts, and, decades later, data across oceans. In a strange way, his crazy idea had not only protected freedom, it had built the foundation for the modern age of information. But to Arthur, the triumph wasn't about fame or recognition. He never sought to be remembered. In fact, for years, his name remained hidden in classified files. It wasn't until long after his death that the full story came out: how a young engineer's obsession with invisible waves helped expose Germany's secret war plan and turned the tide of history. He had always said that science was like light in a storm. It doesn't stop the chaos, but it helps you see your way through it. Decades later, when satellites began circling Earth, each one guided by radar tracking, it felt as though Arthur's legacy had lifted off the ground. His invention now watched over every flight, every storm, every coastline. The echoes that once saved Britain had become the heartbeat of a connected planet. And yet, even with all the advancements, the spirit of that discovery remained the same. A curiosity born from doubt, courage born from ridicule, and faith born from failure. Every blip on a radar screen, every beam scanning the dark sky, carried within it the story of a man who refused to stop looking. As the 20th century raced into the digital era, people often forgot that the internet, GPS, weather satellites, and even self-driving cars all trace their origins back to the same principle: waves bouncing back from the unknown. The same invisible energy that once spotted enemy bombers now guides spacecraft across the solar system. Radar, once dismissed as mad science, became the silent architect of modern civilization. And somewhere in the archives of wartime, England, there's a photograph of Arthur Lonsdale standing beside his machine, tired eyes, soot-stained hands, and a faint smile. On the back of the photo, in his own handwriting, are 4 words: "I saw the echoes." Those echoes, both literal and symbolic, became the signal of victory, not just in war, but in the endless human struggle to understand the unseen forces shaping our world. Today, when air traffic controllers track a plane crossing the Atlantic or meteorologists follow the path of a hurricane, they're echoing the same legacy that began with a single flicker on a screen in 1938. a pulse of light, a whisper of energy, and a man brave enough to believe that what others called madness was, in fact, the truth. Arthur never lived to see how far his invention would reach, from the depths of the oceans to the blackness of space. But the world still moves under the rhythm of his discovery. Every radar sweep, every signal reflected from distant clouds, carries the same message that defined his life, that even in the darkest times, the faintest signal of truth can light the path forward.